James 4:4 says that friendship with the world makes us an enemy of God. So does that mean we're to retreat from engagement in public life and politics completely? We're talking about that next on Significant Insights. Hello and welcome to the program. Good to have you with us. You know, we're in a political season right now, and it begs the question, what does it mean to be a Christian and a citizen? And is there such a thing as responsible Christian engagement in all sorts of public life and even in politics? Just a minute ago, I quoted James, which says that friendship with the world makes us enemies of God. But what does that really mean? Are we as believers not to go out and do good in the world for the sake of the gospel? My guest today, Dr. Vincent Bacote, has deeply thought about these topics. He is an associate professor of theology at Wheaton College, and there he has taught many courses on political theology. He's also written the book, The Political Disciple. It's part of a series of 4 books on ordinary theology. We sat down to talk about faith, politics, and how believers should engage in public life. What's the Christian role in the culture in which we're involved?
Well, I think one thing to start with is, what does your culture allow you to do? What level of participation does your culture allow?
That's a very good point.
So in the United States, we're in a republic where citizens, at least in theory, can become, all the way up to the highest office in the land. I mean, that's the theory, right? And of course, there have been surprising people who've been president, governor, et cetera. So with that backdrop, the point is that you're in a culture where citizens can participate and inform what happens politically.
Which is interesting because I've heard people say, well, we shouldn't be involved. The Apostle Paul, and the other apostles and disciples, they weren't involved in politics. Right. Well, right. You just gave a good answer to that. They couldn't be.
Well, the Roman Empire was a monarchy. Yeah. So it was a very, very small group of people that were going to be influencing the direction of government.
But the Galileans, when Jesus was on earth, really, even some of the apostles, saw him as a political figure.
And Jesus doesn't tell them that he's not political, but what he tells them is, not yet, for the political part that you're talking about. Even after his resurrection, that language in Acts chapter 1, are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel, right? Are you going to march on Rome, take over, show Caesar who's boss now? And Jesus says, sorry, can't tell you the answer to that question just yet. So you have to wait for that. He didn't say it's not going to happen. He says, that's not going to happen yet. In the meantime, you be my witnesses. And I think part of the wedge that we're talking about here is there are people who think about that not yet that he says there. That means Jesus says, therefore, be as apolitical as possible until I come back. Other people, like myself, will see that as be witnesses to the end of the earth, but the fullness of that witness is also in response to the fullness of what God has revealed. And what God has revealed, I would argue from page 1 of the Bible, is that where possible, Christians have a responsibility for managing, stewarding life in this world. That stewardship of life in this world includes politics.
Now you talk about the theology of public life.
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about with this?
Theology of public life. Sometimes people use the word political theology. What I'm trying to do is raise the question, how do we, out of what we believe, how do we understand the fullness of our faith, how does that orient us toward life in God's world? And how is part of that orientation toward life, toward God's world, how in that orientation do we think about the political dimensions of it? It's not the only dimension, but it's certainly one of those dimensions. So how's what we're believing arguably giving us permission to do that? I mean, which is part of the language that I would use, because for the very reason that you said. Because I've been around people who are very, especially when I was in college, I'd say very convincing about the fact that, well, we ought to take a hands-off or keep at a distance public life. And to me, it was only at an intuitional level where I thought we should be engaged, but I didn't have any language for that, and now I do.
Well, my feeling is that we're citizens of the world, we're citizens of this country, and not only do we have an opportunity, we have a responsibility to be involved. in whatever way we can, whether it's running for public office or voting. We should still be involved. But it brings up an interesting point about a person who has been elected to a public office, because the pressure is that you can't bring your Christianity to public office. And I've actually heard Christian politicians say that. You can't really bring that into the political world. How do you respond to that?
I would first ask them, well, what do they think it means to bring your faith to the public life? I mean, I would wager that what they are thinking about is probably primarily more evangelistic and certain dimensions of morality rather than a broader conception of what it means to be Christian in public.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, what I would ask them is, do you think that part of what politics does is that it's oriented toward the public good? And if you think that that's oriented toward the public good, help me understand what you think it means for us in the broadest sense possible and with the greatest impact possible to love our neighbors as ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? And if that's what we're going to do, then, I mean, how is that not political? Right? And how would that not be part of how one is thinking about whether you're in a totalitarian society or a relatively totalitarian society with few parties and few options, or whether in a narrow worldview, or whether you're in a context with a pluralistic worldview? How do you think about, how do you strategize the ways that you're going to have public policies that are going to be oriented for the good of all? So to me, that's inescapably Christian. That's inescapably bringing your faith to public life. So I think it's really too narrow of a vision of what it means to be Christian in public.
Well, also biblically, we talk a lot about standing for biblical truth. One of the responsibilities, I assume, of the church and the culture is to speak biblical truth and to stand for biblical truth. However, the whole concept, for example, of church and state, we discovered that wall is not a solid wall, that it's a very flexible wall that can be stretched over into areas that the church really should be speaking on, whether it's sexuality, human life, and some of the other aspects of it, that because it becomes what we call political, all of a sudden that the church is told, you have to stay out of this because you don't have any business here. But that, I have a real struggle with that. How do you respond?
I have a struggle with that interpretation of the Establishment Clause to begin with. I mean, basically it means that the Anglican Church, for example, isn't the state church of the United States, or the Catholic Church isn't the church of the United States, or Pentecostals or Methodists or whatever. I mean, that's what the Establishment Clause is all about. So it's not directly addressing the question of to what extent faith touches on various matters of concern and how there are laws related to those things. So I sort of, when people would talk about, well, separation of church and state, I would go, well, what kind of separation are you talking about? And then I would also ask those people, so how serious are you about this separation? It's honestly the same way that I think about, what does it mean to bring justice to whatever situation? Because what you'll discover, I think, is that when people care about something and that thing is threatened, they very much want justice for that thing. They may not care about justice for other things, but boy, do they want justice for whatever their pet concern is. So I think it's sort of the same way when it comes to even the separation of church and state. And I think this is part of the challenge, I think, for evangelicals, is evangelicals haven't been, in my view, down the line, consistent about the way they've wanted their faith to impact public life. Yeah. They've been selective about how they want their faith to impact public life. And there have been questions where they haven't been willing to question the culture or cultural norms about things. They just sort of say, well, it's what we do as Americans. And they're not asking the question about where's the tension between certain American norms and being Christian, and they just kind of go with that. And by the way, this is left and right, the ways people do that. And then, I've got my 3 or 4 issues, and around those 3 or 4 issues, then I want to talk about how that has something to do with public life. We've really got to think larger than that.
Differences in the Republican and Democratic parties, and there are many differences, and what evangelicals need to understand about governance and politics. Right after this.
Politics is an incredibly long game. It is very atypical for political change to happen like that. It usually happens, public policy is this long, plodding, very unsexy kind of thing.
Welcome back. Today, theology professor Dr. Vincent Bacote and I are talking about a theology of public life from his book, The Political Disciple. In the book, Dr. Bacote has a discussion in his head debating the validity of engaging with the world in a meaningful way. After all, the Bible warns us not to love the world and reminds us that only what is done for Christ will last. These verses read alone and out of context can make it seem that we shouldn't participate in any kind of non-spiritual activity. And that's where part 2 of our discussion starts. You had an imaginary conversation with self, I'm picking up from the book, about how valuable it is for believers to be engaged
Yes.
in the culture.
Yes.
Who won?
Well, the way that I leave it in the book is like, we'll talk about it later, right? But that was basically me talking about dealing with the whole conception of worldliness and saying, oh, look, God said that humans should be engaged in the world. Wait, isn't being worldly what God says not to be, right? So how do you deal with that, right? And so part of what I'm trying to get at there with that conversation, which I imagine other people have had inside their heads or with actual people, is to say we have to have a more nuanced conception of what we mean by worldliness. Part of the problem is too quickly associating anything with the word creation with whatever is meant by worldly when the Bible talks about don't be worldly. So in James 4:4, you adulterous people, you should have friendship with the world is hatred towards God. But what do you mean by friendship with the world? Or in 1 John 2, do not love the world. Anything, if anyone loves God, you can't love the world. Well, as I like to point out, when it says all that is in the world, isn't it interesting to observe that it has nothing to do with the matter itself, the created order itself. It's really about the ways that humans choose to live their lives in God's creation with a different allegiance. In other words, with allegiance to anyone or anything other than God. I mean, so to be worldly is to live in the world that God had made with a disregard for the God who made the world. So, I mean, that's what I was getting at in that conversation and how I discovered that. But I went through a significant amount of vexation and internal tension about whether Christian faithfulness could include engagement in things that people don't typically identify as spiritual.
Well, an interesting point of that, and I think what could have brought some of that vexation is there probably was considerably, at least I know in my family, I grew up Democratic. All of my family was Democratic. Roosevelt was on a huge pedestal, and everybody was pretty Rooseveltian. Was that what happened with you, being in an African American?
I mean, I'll get to that in a second. But what happened with me is it was what happened in my navigator's experience in college, because I was the guy that liked rock music, and people thought, you shouldn't listen to that music. How can you be a faithful person and listen to that music? And I thought, I didn't have the language then, but I thought, I like how they play. I like that they're good at what they do. It doesn't mean that I want to live their lifestyle. I mean, I wasn't able to articulate that at that time.
Or that I'm affected by,
or exactly,
or
that people are all helpless whenever they're in front of any kind of media. So that people have zero capacity for discernment, actually, which I think says a lot. There's a lot of assumptions there that are false. The political part, I did grow up in a home. I'm born in 1965, so that's when you get the turn for African Americans becoming more aligned with most Democrats. Because Wallace ran for president as a Democrat, and he was sort of like championing segregation. But so when I'm becoming aware of elections and stuff, my family generally voting Democrat. But what I discovered is, in engaging politics, I mean, I'm an independent. Why am I an independent? Because there are things that Democrats have sort of stood for in recent years that are in tension with my political commitments. and there are things that Republicans do that are intentional with my political commitment. I mean, if we were in an environment where you had, I would say, a Democratic Party where it's easier to be pro-life and where there are certain policies that I think are not just tending towards, arguably, stereotypically speaking, big government things, I might be leaning toward that. If there was a Republican Party that, when you talk about tax cuts, et cetera, it's like, you know what, I don't care if you talk about that if you do nothing about depressed neighborhoods that exist because of government activities to segregate minorities and keep them away from the wealth building that happens with home ownership, post World War II especially. So if you're doing nothing about that, and then you basically say, well, tax cuts will just allow all boats to rise, I'm like, are you kidding? It's like you theorize about these things as if stuff is just going to happen over here, and then you actually don't provide an actual alternative.
But to some degree, white evangelicals are considered critically so as Republican.
That's a modern development, as in last 40 years. 1976, year of the evangelical, right? Well, that's Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, right? So arguably, I said you got this turn in 65, with civil rights laws, Johnson, et cetera, African Americans from the party of Lincoln to Democrats. Around the era of Reagan is when you begin to get more of this gravitation towards.
Well, I remember when Jimmy Carter was running for president, that there were evangelicals that were incredibly concerned. I remember a conversation I had, particularly with D. James Kennedy, that was one of the worst mistakes America could make, and this guy was a Christian.
Yeah.
But his politics were not conservative politics at all. I agree with you. Both parties, I think, miss a lot of that. But there are values and principles that are involved that probably drive evangelicals to a particular direction.
They have since perhaps Goldwater, perhaps since Goldwater, perhaps since Reagan, right?
Yeah.
The interesting thing about the Reagan moment to me is he was a really good debater, really clear about his big picture ideas. Carter didn't want to debate, right? And then, the one debate he did debate, he didn't do well. But even the Democrats didn't want, Carter to be president. So he was like an outsider and outsider. But Reagan cast a particular conception of America, and he could do it in a way. I always joke with people that at a Reagan press conference, even people who disagreed with him, before it was over, strangely you saw their heads start nodding all of a sudden, because they were agreeing with him. Because, there's the whole great communicator. He was really good at that.
Yeah.
And I do think, by the way, contrary to what some people say, he was a lot smarter than people think he was, and much more insightful. It was just that he was, to me, a big vision caster type of president. So and this galvanized a lot of people. To me, the tricky thing about it in terms of Christians being for Reagan, I think a question that people have to ask is, okay, how much in terms of public policy did people actually get from Reagan, as opposed to how much did they get in terms of saying, I care about these issues? There's some people who would say, well, Republicans do to evangelicals what Democrats do to African Americans. We talk about your issues and do nothing.
Do nothing, yeah.
Right? And, to which I think is somewhat true, but then I also say this about political engagement that I think is one of the biggest things I think evangelicals miss. Politics is an incredibly long game. It is very atypical for political change to happen like that. It usually public policy is this long, plodding, very unsexy kind of thing. And the way that people think, a lot of evangelicals think about politics is it's 3 or 4 issues. You think about it like, you don't think about politics like you think about the fire department. You pay attention to it when there's an alarm. The rest of the time, you sort of trust things till things go bad, when really there needs to be a kind of slow and steady as she goes approach to politics,
Yep.
and that kind of engagement and commitment to politics. This is how you will really get
Yep.
most of the change that happens. And that's not the way that people are being informed about how to participate in politics.
I would agree with that. Thank you for being with me.
It's great to be here.
I always enjoy the discussion. I
Thanks a lot.
appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks a lot.
You can get more information on Dr. Vincent Bacote at vincentbacote.com, and you can get his book, The Political Disciple, online wherever books are sold. Final thoughts on God's will right after this.
So if you want to know what God's will is for your life at this point, rejoice. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're happy about everything, but you can rejoice in the power of the Spirit.
Today we talked about the need for Christians to engage in public life. When it comes to politics, it's easy to get frustrated because we want quick results. But as Dr. Bacote said, politics is a long game. Still, we have a lot to be thankful for in our country. Our political system is set up so that an actor, a peanut farmer, or an African-American child raised by his white grandparents can reach the highest office in the land. Dr. Winfred Neely, professor at Moody Bible Institute, talks about thankfulness and the will of God in today's final thoughts.
In the scripture, irrespective of what's going on in life, there are three things that should characterize us. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks. And then we're told the reason why. For this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. So if you want to know what God's will is for your life at this point, rejoice. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're happy about everything, but you can rejoice in the power of the Spirit. Pray without ceasing. Have an attitude of prayer. Doesn't mean that you're talking to God 24/7, but this is the posture of your heart. Ongoing fellowship with God, and in everything give thanks. It doesn't necessarily mean that you give thanks for everything, but in every situation, child of God, brother and sister in Christ in which you find yourself, may God grant you the grace to give thanks to Him. There's something always for which we can give God thanks. This is God's will for you in Christ Jesus.
I really would like to thank Dr. Neely for his comments. I've had the opportunity to interview Dr. Neely on a couple of occasions, and always very insightful and always very uplifting and also very challenging. And one of the things that I think that we need to understand as Americans is that we have a lot to be thankful for. There are places in the world where even to express your thought can not only get you in jail, it can get you killed. Here in America, we still have the opportunity to express our thoughts. We still have the opportunity to go to the polls and to vote. There are incredible opportunities that we have, and I thank God that I'm an American, and I thank God for the freedoms that I have grown up with, that we've all grown up with. And I think we should keep that in mind, and also we should work hard to protect those by taking advantage of them. And every one of us, sometimes you think, well, I just don't want to get involved. I've heard people say, well, I'm not even going to vote. Well, when you do that, then you're limiting the freedoms that you've been given. All of us need to not only be aware, in fact, we need to be very aware. We need to take the time to see what the issues are and to see what candidates that we are considering voting for are what is their position, what are their values, and do they match up with your values? Do they match up with the values that we want to see in America? All of those things are important, but being a responsible citizen and being thankful for that opportunity is absolutely vital. Thanks for joining me.